I thought the old pediatric floor was empty. Then someone whispered my name from a room that had been locked for years. I was standing inside Riverside Children's Hospital with my friends, holding my flashlight tightly while the cold air moved through the dark hallway. Nobody laughed when the voice called my name because everyone heard it. The whisper came again from room 214. The strange part was that the door had been sealed before we arrived. We had checked every room on that floor, and there was no possible way anyone could have been inside. That was the moment our simple overnight exploration became something we couldn't explain. My friends Jake, Ryan, Mia, Lucas and I had planned this trip for weeks. The hospital was scheduled to be demolished soon, and we wanted to record one final exploration before it disappeared. The building had been abandoned for almost 10 years after a newer hospital opened across the city. People online shared stories about strange sounds and empty rooms, but I never believed them. I thought abandoned places only felt scary because people expected something frightening to happen. We entered through a broken section of the back fence just after midnight with cameras, sleeping bags, snacks and portable lights. The first few floors looked exactly how we expected. Dust covered the desks, old medical equipment sat untouched in storage rooms, and broken windows allowed the cold wind to move through the halls. The smell of old medicine and wet concrete filled the building. Every step echoed for several seconds before disappearing into the darkness. Jake kept making jokes, but even he became quieter when we reached the pediatric wing. Something about that floor felt different, like the hospital was still holding on to a memory. The walls of the pediatric hallway were covered with faded cartoon animals. Small plastic chairs were still placed outside old examination rooms, and children's drawings hung on a bulletin board near the elevator. Some drawings were damaged, but a few messages were still visible. "Get well soon. I love my family." Looking at those drawings made the abandoned hospital feel strangely alive. It was like the people who left never had a chance to say goodbye. At the end of the hallway, we found room 214. Earlier, we noticed an old chain wrapped around the door handle, but now it was lying on the floor. The door was slightly open, moving slowly with the cold air coming from inside. Jake walked toward it and pushed the door with one hand. The rusty hinges created a loud sound that echoed through the empty hallway. Inside was a small patient room with a single bed, an old chair and a dusty window, but something immediately felt wrong. The room was cleaner than every other part of the hospital. The bed was perfectly arranged, and a small blue stuffed rabbit was sitting on the pillow without a single layer of dust. Mia stared at it and whispered that someone must have placed it there recently. Nobody answered because we were all thinking the same thing. After 10 years of being abandoned, there was no reason that toy should look untouched. I raised my camera and started recording. While filming the room, I noticed a small whiteboard beside the bed. Most of the writing had faded, but one sentence was still clear. "Patient returns tonight." I tried to convince myself it was just an old message left behind before the hospital closed. Jake said someone probably wrote it years ago, but his voice sounded nervous. Before we could leave, the lights above us started flickering. Once, then twice, and suddenly the entire hallway went dark. Our flashlights became the only source of light. Nobody moved because we were listening to something coming from inside room 214. A slow tapping sound came from the darkness. I looked at my friends, and everyone had the same expression. Jake whispered that someone might be inside, but the room was completely visible from where we stood. There was nowhere anyone could hide. Ryan stepped backward and dropped his camera. When he picked it up, his face changed. He looked at the screen for several seconds without speaking. Then he slowly turned the camera toward us. The last frame showed room 214, but in the reflection of the window behind the bed, there was a small figure standing near the corner. It looked like a child wearing an old hospital gown. We immediately turned around and looked inside the room. Nobody was there. The room was empty, but the blue stuffed rabbit had moved. It was no longer facing the pillow. It was facing the doorway where we were standing. Then, from somewhere deep inside the abandoned hospital, a child's voice whispered through the darkness. "You're finally back." I thought the abandoned hospital basement was just an old storage area. I was wrong. The first sign that something was not right came when we heard knocking from behind a concrete wall that was not supposed to exist. At first, I thought it was an old pipe making noise beneath the building, but the sound came again. 3 slow knocks, followed by a short pause. It sounded like someone was trying to get our attention. I looked at my friends, waiting for someone to explain it, but nobody said anything. We all stood there silently, listening to a sound coming from a place that shouldn't have been there. My friends and I discovered the hospital while searching for unusual locations to record a documentary-style exploration. The building was mostly abandoned, but some upper floors were still used for storage. There were 4 of us, me, Daniel, Chris, and Emma. We entered through a damaged side entrance just before midnight with cameras, flashlights, and recording equipment. Near the entrance, an old security guard noticed us. He didn't stop us, but before we walked deeper inside, he gave us a strange warning. He looked toward the elevator and quietly said, "Stay away from the old basement." Chris smiled and asked him what was down there. The guard didn't smile back. He simply looked at the elevator and said, "That floor isn't on the building map anymore." At the time, we thought he was trying to scare us. We thanked him and continued exploring. The first few hours were normal. We walked through empty patient rooms, old offices, and abandoned hallways covered with dust. Broken medical equipment was left exactly where it had been years earlier, making the hospital feel like everyone had disappeared suddenly. Everything changed when we found the old freight elevator near the back hallway. The buttons showed floors 1 through 6, but below them was another small metal button with no number. It looked newer than the others, almost like someone had added it later. Chris pointed at it and laughed, saying there was no way it worked. Before anyone could stop him, he pressed the button. The elevator shook, the lights flickered, and the old metal doors slowly closed. None of us spoke as the elevator moved downward. The strange part was that the hospital only had 6 floors above ground, but the elevator kept going lower. After several seconds, it stopped. The doors opened, revealing a hallway beneath the hospital. A hallway that wasn't shown on any map or record. Cold air moved toward us from the darkness, carrying the smell of old medicine and damp concrete. On the dusty floor, we saw something that made us stop. Footprints, fresh footprints, leading deeper into the basement. Emma whispered that someone had been down there recently. Nobody wanted to follow them, but we were already standing inside a place that should not have existed. We slowly walked forward, recording everything. The walls looked older than the rest of the hospital, and faded room numbers were painted beside each door. Some rooms were empty, while others still contained old hospital beds covered with white sheets. Then we found a sign hanging on the wall that said, "Recovery Ward." Emma immediately stopped walking. She had researched the hospital before we came, and according to every record she found, there was no basement recovery ward. There were no rooms below the building and no information about this hidden floor. We continued until we reached the end of the hallway. That was when we heard the knocking again. This time it was louder and clearer. The sound was coming from behind a concrete wall near an old storage room. Daniel slowly placed his hand against the wall and quickly pulled it away. He said the concrete was freezing cold. Before anyone could answer, something knocked from the other side. We stepped back because there was no door, no opening, and no possible way someone could be behind that wall. Chris raised his camera and started recording the area. While moving the camera across the floor, he noticed something lying near the wall. It was an old hospital wristband. The plastic was damaged, but the name and date were still readable. The patient's admission date was tomorrow. We thought it was a mistake, so we checked it again. The date was correct. It was tomorrow's date. Before we could understand what we were seeing, every light in the basement turned off at the same time. The hallway disappeared into complete darkness, and the only sound we could hear was our own breathing. Then, from behind the concrete wall, a voice whispered, "You're not supposed to be here."